Picture a cat doing exactly what your cat did this morning. Waking up slowly, stretching in a patch of sunlight, yawning wide enough to show every tooth, then padding over to demand food from the nearest human. Now picture that same behavior happening 5,000 years ago. The same stretch, the same yawn, the same entitled stare. That's the strange thing about cats. Of all the animals humanity has lived alongside, cats are the ones who change the least. And understanding why requires going back to a world that looks almost nothing like ours, but somehow produced a creature that fits perfectly into it. So what was life actually like for ancient cats? Not the mythology, not the artwork, but the day-to-day biological reality of being a small predator embedded in early human civilization. Let's go back to where the whole story begins. About 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, a wildcat made a calculated decision. Not a conscious one, but a behavioral one. Instead of fleeing from human settlements the way most wild animals did, certain individuals of a species called Felis sylvestris libica began lingering around the edges of early farming villages. These weren't domesticated cats. They were wild cats with a slightly higher tolerance for human proximity than their relatives. And that tolerance turned out to be enormously valuable because early agriculture created something that had never existed before in nature at that scale: grain storage. Grain storage meant grain. Grain meant rodents. Rodents meant a concentrated, predictable food source that a patient, solitary predator could exploit without ever needing to hunt across wide territory. The cats who stayed near human settlements ate better than the cats who didn't. They reproduced more successfully. Their kittens inherited that slightly reduced fear response. Generation by generation, almost without anyone intending it, a new kind of cat began to emerge. This is the thing that makes cat domestication so different from dog domestication. Dogs were actively selected. Humans chose which animals to breed, which to keep, which to train. Cats essentially domesticated themselves. They found a niche in the human world, inserted themselves into it, and humans let them stay because the arrangement was mutually beneficial. Ancient Egyptian grain stores had cats. Ancient Mesopotamian granaries had cats. Wherever humans stored food, cats showed up to eat whatever came to eat the food. The relationship was transactional from the very beginning, and in some ways it still is. Now, here's where life for ancient cats gets genuinely interesting, because the biology of a wild Felis sylvestris libica and the biology of an early domestic cat were almost identical. The same hunting instincts, the same territorial behavior, the same solitary nature, the same crepuscular activity patterns, meaning most active at dawn and dusk when rodents move. What changed was context, not biology. An ancient cat living near an Egyptian village around 3,000 years ago would have spent most of its time doing things that would look completely familiar today. Sleeping, roughly 16 hours of it, though not always in comfortable spots. Patrolling a territory that might cover several acres. Engaging in intense, short bursts of hunting, followed by long periods of inactivity. Grooming obsessively. But the environment around that behavior was radically different from both the African savanna, where the species evolved, and the modern apartment where most cats now live. Ancient cats in Egypt weren't just tolerated, they were eventually elevated. The goddess Bastet, originally depicted as a lioness and later as a domestic cat, became one of the most widely worshipped figures in Egyptian religion. Cats were kept in temples. They were mummified by the millions, sometimes bred specifically to be offered as religious dedications. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a serious crime. When a household cat died, family members shaved their eyebrows in mourning. For a cat, what did this actually mean in practice? It meant living in close proximity to large numbers of humans without significant fear. It meant being fed intentionally rather than having to hunt for every meal, though evidence suggests ancient Egyptian cats still hunted extensively. It meant social exposure from kittenhood in a way that produced animals more comfortable with human contact than their wild relatives. Bone analysis of cats from ancient Egyptian sites shows something telling. The cats were well fed. They show fewer signs of nutritional stress than wild populations. They also show signs of living to older ages, which wild cats rarely do. A wild cat that survives to 7 or 8 years is genuinely old. Ancient Egyptian temple cats may have regularly lived longer than that, simply because they had consistent food and weren't competing with large predators for survival. But Egypt wasn't the only place. Cats spread, and as they spread, the story changes. Genetic studies have traced 2 major waves of cat dispersal from their origin point in the Near East. The first wave moved with early farmers across Europe and parts of Asia, those same tolerant of humans cats following grain stores across the ancient world. The second wave was driven by ancient Egypt specifically, and those cats carry distinct genetic markers that show up in cat populations across Europe, the Middle East, and eventually much further. Sailors loved cats. This is not sentimental speculation, it's practical logic. A ship carrying grain or dried food across the Mediterranean had a rodent problem. Cats solved the rodent problem. Ancient Greek and Roman ships carried cats. Viking ships carried cats. Cats followed trade routes the way diseases and ideas did, moving along the pathways of human commerce and eventually reaching places where no wild cat had ever lived. A cat on a Roman merchant vessel in the 2nd century had a genuinely strange life, confined to a small space, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and the constant motion of open water, exposed to sailors who may have treated them as practical tools or as genuine companions, depending on the individual. Roman sources mention cats in domestic settings with enough regularity to suggest they were common, though never universal, presences in Roman households. Roman cats, like Egyptian cats, ate what they could catch and what they were given. Grain stores attracted rodents. Rodents attracted cats, and the cycle continued. Mosaic art from Pompeii shows cats in hunting postures, cats being fed, cats that look startlingly like cats today. The body language is identical. The ambivalence toward human authority is identical. Here's the thing that keeps coming up in the archaeological record. Ancient cats were not pets in the modern sense. They were not companion animals kept primarily for emotional satisfaction. They were working animals who happened to be tolerable to live with. The emotional attachment humans felt toward them was real. The Egyptian mourning rituals make that clear, but the foundation of the relationship was functional. Cats earned their place by doing something useful. This is actually visible in how the relationship varied across cultures. In places where grain storage was critical, cats were valued and often protected. In places with fewer rodent pressures or different agricultural systems, cats were less embedded in human life. Medieval European attitudes toward cats were famously more hostile than Egyptian attitudes, partly because the symbolic and religious associations had shifted, and partly because the utilitarian logic was less consistently applied. A cat in medieval Europe had a genuinely harder life than a cat in ancient Egypt. Less consistent protection, more variable treatment, still fulfilling the same biological role of controlling rodent populations, but without the theological shield that Egyptian cats enjoyed. And through all of this, across 10,000 years of living alongside humans, the cat's body barely changed. This is the part that requires a moment to actually sit with. Dogs show enormous physical variation across breeds because humans selectively bred them for specific tasks and appearances over thousands of years. Ancient Egyptian cattle look different from modern cattle because of selective breeding. Ancient grain crops look different from modern ones. Selection pressure changes things dramatically over thousands of generations. Cats, for most of their time with humans, experienced almost no intentional selective breeding. Humans didn't choose which cats to pair together. Cats chose their own mates based on cat criteria, which meant the same territorial competition, the same mate selection signals, the same behavioral drivers that governed wildcat reproduction. What changed was the environment, the food availability, the reduced predator pressure, the increased human contact. What didn't change was the shape, the size, the hunting behavior, the social structure. A Felis sylvestris libica from North Africa today looks almost exactly like the cats painted on Egyptian tomb walls. The cats painted on Egyptian tomb walls look almost exactly like the cat currently sleeping somewhere in your home. 5,000 years of living with humans, and the cat's fundamental form is almost unchanged. This tells you something important about the nature of the relationship. Cats were never fully domesticated in the same sense that dogs or cattle were. They retained their evolutionary toolkit almost entirely intact because they were never forced to lose it. The hunting instinct your cat demonstrates with crinkle balls and laser pointers is the same instinct that cleared grain stores in ancient Egypt, supplied ships crossing the Mediterranean, kept rodent populations in check across civilizations, and allowed a small African wildcat to become one of the most globally distributed mammals on Earth. Ancient cats lived in a world that was noisier, more dangerous, more physically demanding, and less comfortable than the world modern cats inhabit. They slept in granaries instead of on couches. They drank from irrigation ditches instead of filtered water bowls. They dealt with parasites and predators and competition that most modern indoor cats never encounter. But the experience of being a cat, the internal architecture of hunting and sleeping and grooming and claiming territory and tolerating humans on their own terms, that experience was not fundamentally different from what it is today, which might be the most remarkable thing about them. Every other domestic species shows the fingerprints of human intervention. Cats show the fingerprints of cats. They entered the human world on their own terms, changed it to suit themselves about as much as they changed themselves to suit it, and 10,000 years later, they're still doing exactly that. The cat on your couch isn't a domesticated animal in the way your dog is domesticated. It's a wild animal that decided the arrangement worked and has been renegotiating the terms ever since.